You can be a successful startup and serve 5% of a marketplace. If you're missing 5% of the marketplace in government, you're in trouble. With regard to how AI can help the delivery of public services, I think it is a little too early to tell. The slowness can be also a little healthy in this regard.
Things from the pandemic was just the difficulty of the unemployment insurance system. It used to be that you had to call to get your password. By being able to reset your password without having to get somebody on the phone, we've been able to make the experience take 30, 40 minutes less. It's one of these things where there are massive improvements where artificial intelligence can be useful.
We're sitting on huge amounts of data, and there are non-obvious correlations inside that data that could help inform policies and programs that it is difficult for humans to sign. I think one application of AI that I'm excited about.
You could imagine in a not too distant world where you just say, here's my profile, I make this much money, I have this many kids, I work here, and government says, great, here are the 5 different things that you're eligible for. And those are the kinds of problems that I think we're pretty close to being able to solve, and certainly AI could help. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of Political Capital, the Tech of State. My name is Nate Loewentheil. I am the founder and managing partner of Commonweal Ventures. Political Capital is a conversation series exploring the intersection of technology, policy, and finance. Today, we'll be speaking with 3 esteemed guests: Johnny Dach, the Chief of Staff to the Governor of Connecticut; Dennis Zeveloff, the Chief Policy Director for the state of New Jersey; and Micah Lasher, who was until very, very recently the Director of Policy for New York State. I'll give them slightly longer introductions in a moment. First, I want to frame the conversation, and then we'll walk through some questions for our panelists. And then towards the end, we'll have a chance for audience Q&A. There should be a Q&A function in your Zoom, so you can ask questions at any point during the webinar, and then I'll tee them up for our speakers. So just to frame the conversation for a moment, we hear a lot in the media, not just these days, but all days, about the role of the federal government in the technology sector. So we hear about the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. We hear about AI policy, antitrust policy. And of course, what the federal government does matters. But I think the focus on the federal government distracts from the very vital role of state governments in our technology sector. And as Dennis, Johnny, and Micah know better than most, state governments really set the rules of the road for a lot of businesses, including businesses in the technology sector. They invest considerable resources in R&D, especially through the state university systems, but also through other state institutions, and of course are enormous consumers of goods and services, including a lot of technology spend. And to put that in perspective, state and local governments combined spend about $4.5 trillion per year procuring goods and services, which is as much as Walmart, Amazon, Exxon, Apple, and the next 17 largest multinational corporations in the US put together. So they are a big chunk of the US economy and have a really significant role in the technology sector, but one that is not often discussed. And for reasons I want to get into, I think entrepreneurs are missing a big opportunity here. There is a huge chunk of the market focused on, B2B enterprise software, and only 2% of entrepreneurs are focused on government technology. And I think that's missing an economic opportunity for businesses and also missing an opportunity to contribute to the vital work of our state governments around the country. So before we get into that, just some slightly longer introductions. Again, Johnny, Dennis, Micah, thank you guys so much for being here today. Johnny, as I mentioned, is the Chief of Staff to the Governor of Connecticut, Ned Lamont. He previously served in the Obama administration in the State Department, working for the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues. He's a graduate of Yale University, where he received both a BA and a JD. Micah Lasher, as I mentioned, was until very recently the Director of Policy for Governor Hochul in New York State. He previously served as Chief of Staff for the Attorney General for New York State and as Head of Policy and Communications for Sidewalk Lab, which was a real leader in this country thinking about innovation for cities. When he was an undergraduate at NYU, he famously in New York City founded SKD Knickerbocker, a very successful political and communications firm. Dennis is the Chief Policy Advisor to Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey. Dennis was on the governor's election campaign back in 2017 Has been a vital member of his staff over the last 6+ years. Dennis holds a JD and MBA from Yale and a BA from Dartmouth. So again, thank you guys all so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. So I guess the first question is thinking about the role of your of technology in helping you guys meet the needs of your states. All of your states have really prioritized the kind of digital aspect of government services over the past couple of years and launched major technology initiatives. Connecticut consolidated its IT services under new Bureau of Information Technology Solutions. New Jersey passed an important act, the 21st Century Integrated Digital Experience Act. Dennis, I think I got that right, which requires state agencies to improve their digital services and workflows. And Micah, New York, has done a number of things, including a new Joint Security Operations Center to help address cybersecurity issues at the state level. As you guys look around and each of you are in a privileged position in your state, what are some specific ways where you see opportunity for entrepreneurs to help you, not so much in terms of the policy, but really implementing and delivering goods and services for the members of your states?
All right, I'll give sort of a cheap answer, which is maybe also the chief of staff answer, and then I'll let that smarter policy brackets give the one that's more tailored to state government, which is it's the same ways the folks on the phone are doing it. Right? I think we underestimate the extent to which state government is a large employer and a large business, a lot like any other. We've got Connecticut, smallest state here, 32,000 executive branch employees, 62 million feet of office space, 3.6 million constituents who are just customers looking for a 21st century customer experience. And the bad news is that the public sector is always going to lag the private sector in adopting IT to serve those needs. A combination of the public scrutiny, the lack of competition, our longstanding and hardworking employees make us risk averse and make us a tough place for new technology. And so entrepreneurs are going to have a hard time coming in here with something that needs to be piloted, at least in IT. And if you want to pilot a technology going hasn't been battle tested, it's going to need to be miles better, which is better than the industry standard offering. But the good news is, because we're slow moving, there are lots of low-hanging fruit inside government for that battle tested tech to be rolled out in ways that are tailored to our needs. And I'll give you a Connecticut example, which is the most popular thing Governor Lamont has done in law office, we managed the hell out of the COVID pandemic, is move a few high-volume DMV transactions online. So you can renew your driver's license from your instead from a branch office, which allowed some higher-powered users to get online rather than in line, and because it drew down the volumes, service centers allowed everyone who's still going in person in the left. People stop state employees in grocery store aisles to say how genius this was.
Wow.
They act like we're rocket scientists, and the reality is we moved a couple of routine transactions onto a Salesforce platform that we should have done 10 years ago. It's standard blocking and tackling in the private sector, and we did it in that case. We could do it in a lot more for Washington, and it would make a big difference in terms of our operations and the people we're serving, even though it's not unique to government.
That's a great example, though, because it shows you how big a difference it makes. I mean, people really hate going to the DMV, and all of a sudden people think you guys are geniuses. So it can have a big impact. Dennis, Micah, are there specific areas you guys are thinking about for your states?
No, I think to put sort of a different spin on what Johnny said, anything we can do where we're taking something and taking a process that can be incredibly difficult, or taking a process that, you actually have to show up in person, you have to do something that involves a lot of heavy paperwork, and you could bring that directly to the resident, is the sort of, I think in a lot of cases, it's low-hanging fruit that we're looking at. It sort of seems like each state has probably figured this out across one service delivery system. So, in New Jersey, for the acronym soup, it's the MVC instead of the DMV. But every time we've been able to move something online there, you're making it so people aren't going out of their way to wait in line at like 10 a.m. on a weekday. One of the biggest things from the pandemic was just the difficulty of the unemployment insurance system. We've been doing sort of a series of gradual modular improvements to ours, but it used to be that you had to call to get your password. By being able to reset your password without having to get somebody on the phone, we've been able to make the experience take, 30, 40 minutes less. It's one of these things where there are massive improvements, possible, as Johnny said, based on some fairly simple pieces. And then, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, but I think anything that we're sort of looking at where artificial intelligence could be useful is something that, especially in New Jersey, we're trying to have all agencies look at this point. So, I mean, I think to your point about bringing, oh, sorry.
No, you'd mentioned to me property tax rebates is another area you guys were thinking about.
Absolutely. So, and, I think that's also one of these things where, it's very important for us to show that we're doing what we can to lower property taxes in New Jersey. But sort of across the board, anything where, just going from a paper check to direct deposit, anything where you're making something more immediate or bringing down that processing time becomes a major, goal for us.
I think I will apologize in advance for being a little sometimes pessimistic. It's my neurotic nature. I think that maybe a little bit of what Johnny said. It is an uneasy fit. It is an intrinsically uneasy fit between government and innovative entrepreneurs. This is something we thought a lot about at Sidewalk Labs. My old boss, Dan Dach used to talk about that we're focused on cities and the different way that urbanists and technologists think about the world and think about problems. It's really true. And so it is a rare event that, an idea or a solution that an innovator has from the outside is going to fit neatly into that peg is going to fit neatly into a particular hole that government is trying to fill. And so and you cannot underestimate the thinness of the bandwidth of those of us in government that we have to spend time outside of a crisis thinking about how to make that peg fit into the hole. It should be otherwise, but I think that is an unfortunate sort of reality. And so with that in mind, I would just say two things that are perhaps a little bit of a circuitous answer to your question. One, and this is this is asking people to be altruistic. This is not anybody's near-term business interest, but perhaps over the long term. We need talent. The number of people in government who really have sophistication on issues of technology, it's a handful, and they can make an enormous difference. A small number of talented people can make an enormous difference. You mentioned the JSOC that we are doing in New York State, not we anymore, it just left, but the New York State is doing. That's being driven by one really talented guy, our chief cyber officer. I've had one colleague, Gabe Paley, who has been incredibly focused on customer experience and time tax and how those interactions get better. He pushed the administration to prioritize it. The administration just hired a chief customer experience officer, Tanya Webster. She's making a huge difference. That's three people that are making an enormous difference. And so encouraging people to do a tour of duty in government, I think, can make a big difference. And the other thing I would say, and it's related, is taking the time to really get under the hood of what the needs and complexities are of the problems that government is trying to solve, that a particular innovation may be purporting to try to solve, to narrow that gap between peg and hole as much as possible before you're going in and talking to the beleaguered public servant who has, 5 minutes of calendar time and even less of brain time to figure it out.
I was going to say something similar to that, Mike. I mean, our experience as venture investors into companies, some of which are selling into government, is actually that if you have a specific product that is solving an actual pain point for a government agency, it's actually not as hard to sell into it because it's much more acute. And so, for example, one of our companies, Dach Technologies, helps local governments more at the city and county level, at the state level, to track short-term rental properties and to basically collect taxes and fees from them if they're not paying them, and they have rules on the books that they should be paying them. And that's it's very immediate. It's a very clear sort of value add. It reduces a financial ROI. And there are other examples out there as well. So it's one thing to try to reorganize a whole tax system. It's another thing to say, look, we're going to help you collect more tax revenue from this very specific, source of potential income. I guess just one follow-up on that. Dennis, you already, I think, mentioned, or Johnny, the kind of potential for AI here. Do you see AI are you guys exploring how that might help you deliver some government services? Is it sort of a little too early to tell and come back in 5 years? Or how are you guys thinking about that in terms of the actual delivery of some of the work you're doing? Come back in 5 years.
I think New York is like a lot of is in the regard of with regard to how AI can help the delivery of public services. I think we're in the same spot as a lot of states, which is we've tasked agencies with really looking at what they are doing and how AI can be used to help deliver public services. What are risks and things to be cognizant of that we may want to put guardrails around in the near term. But I think it is a little too early to tell. We made a decision in New York. I think, don't mean to speak for New Jersey, but I think New York and New Jersey are both exploring this sort of realm of how do we create kind of critical mass within the state to, utilize AI technology by nonprofit research institutions to kind of, if not catch up with what private sector interests are doing to at least be in the game. But in terms of the delivery of public services, I think it's early yet, and I think the inevitable nature will be that government will be a late adopter, and that is sort of partly about slowness, but also partly, I think, about a healthy caution. If you're to be a success, you can be a successful startup and serve 5% of a marketplace. If you're missing 5% of the marketplace in government, you're in trouble. So I think the slowness can be also a little healthy in this regard.
I would just add one piece on AI, and I agree with everything Micah said, but pulling the lens back briefly from government service delivery to government policy making, we're sitting on huge amounts of data, and there are non-obvious correlations inside that data that could help inform policies and programs that it is difficult for humans to sign. I think one application of AI that I'm excited about that may be not unique, but where government can leveraging to help us stop those, and then bringing human policies.
I mean, one potential related piece there, Johnny, which I think is far off, and Micah, to your point, reasonably so, is providing government services in a more integrated fashion. By which I mean, right now, if you're a low-income resident of any state, not specific to your states, you're applying here for food stamps and there for for health care, and a third place for some other educational benefits. And it is a natural outgrowth of the way government works, that there are different agencies delivering different services with slightly different requirements for who gets them. But you could imagine in a not too distant world where you just say, here's my profile, I make this much money, I have this many kids, I work here, and government says, great, here are the 5 different things that you're eligible for. And those are the kinds of problems that I think we're pretty close to being able to solve, and certainly AI could help.
Yeah, I would just note that the closer we get to that world, and it's a world we need to reach, the more vulnerable we become to identity theft issues and fraud issues. And so we need the help of everyone focused on government to prevent those outcomes. Right? The California unemployment insurance system admits to losing $20 billion to fraud over the first year and a half of the pandemic. And if you ask people who don't work for them, they'd tell you it's 50% higher. That's bigger than the Connecticut General Fund out the door to friends. And the more digital we get, the more vulnerable we become. And we need solutions that protect systems and users from those outcomes, while also making the user experience easier rather than harder. Every time we introduce a CAPTCHA or a complex password requirement, we lose folks.
And Mike, I think that gets to your point where government is just not the same as a private entity. It's not okay to serve one portion of the market. If every time you create some new digital experience, you're blocking out someone who doesn't have a computer. I mean, you're just serving a broader set of constituents, and you have a different set of kind of liabilities and exposures.
I think that's right. I mean, one thing that's been interesting, I think, in the discussion around kind of customer service in a governmental context is I actually think we have mostly moved past the concerns around access via device and technology. I mean, hey, look, there is still a digital divide that is significant, that is something government needs to continue working on. But I think you hear a lot less of a concern about the move to digitize interactions with government than you did even just 5, certainly 10 years ago. And we still have, there are still laws on the books that require, things to be done by paper, and you're kind of it never ceases to amaze the political obstacles you run into trying to move away from those. But I think the field of kind of integrated eligibility you talked about, Nate, there is a project the New York State government has been working on called Integrated Eligibility Services, which is exactly what you're talking about, which is how do you kind of create one-stop shopping for all the various social programs. And that has been going on. That project has been in the works for a decade, and it will be complete if we're lucky in a decade. It runs at about the pace of building the Second Avenue subway. And it's extraordinary, and it's not because there aren't really talented people and lots of money being thrown at it. It's complicated, and we're not the best at this. And so I think that those challenges will continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Something like it sounds easy to describe, but as a practical matter, the sort of bureaucratic and political and legal hurdles to it are actually immense. Some of the money's coming from the feds, so actually they don't want you to mix around the data or what have you. One question I was thinking about coming to this, and Mike, you already touched on it. I'd be, Dennis, curious to see if you have thoughts. Government is slow. It's never going to be a startup. It shouldn't be. It's hard to get things done. At the same time, like, the pace of change in society is accelerating. And I do wonder if there is the potential for government to move more quickly. And I mean, it was actually interesting during COVID, governments actually responded really quickly. And actually, like, when there's a crisis, government actually, can respond at serious speed. And I think was a testament to the quality of our public institutions. Again, and AI may provide other opportunities. Do you see the pace of change in government with respect to technology accelerating, or sort of like, yeah, when there's a real crisis, things move more quickly, but otherwise it's sort of status quo?
I think it is accelerating. I think part of it is that, this builds on itself. So, too jargony, but whatever flywheel effect you want to throw out. It's like, as we do more to put more services on the cloud or digitize different pieces, we are able to start moving at a more quick pace. I think some of the choke points that, Micah and Johnny have flagged, whether it's, I think, state procurement, is one of the major time issues, anything in terms of sort of public comment, that type of piece. I think that's always one of the big pieces on pace of change. But especially if you have something where there's like a singular focus on it, and the pandemic was very good at sort of sharpening that focus, being able to sort of address some of those procurement, some of those issues. And then I think just having the infrastructure there to move things more quickly, I think a lot of that does make the pace of change speed up.
You just kind of broached our next topic, Dennis, which is about the sort of, the challenges of selling into government. For reasons we've already talked about a little bit, there are good reasons government's not going to move as quickly. But I personally would love to see more entrepreneurs trying to build products and services that do solve some of the pain points for government. Again, both because I think there's a lot of economic opportunity, but also because, I believe good government is important for a functioning society. And, the DMV example may be trivial, but for someone's life, it's actually a big deal to save a couple hours and the hassle and the frustration. And, speaking of flywheels, like, the better government does, the more people believe in government, and the worse government does, the less people believe in government. So, as people who've just worked in and around these institutions in different capacities over the years, what would be your advice to founders who are trying to sell into government or thinking about building a GovTech business? Not again on necessarily specifics, but how to approach or how to think about or how to identify problems.
I moved to Connecticut, first of all. Yeah,
I was waiting for the first pitch for the state of Connecticut to come out.
We've got a VC army of that structured program that allows Connecticut-based companies to cut through some of the government stuff that we're dealing with. I say one thing, again, to pull the lens back. We've been talking mostly about IT, GovTech, and the challenges that they may face getting in the door, because government's going to be a late adopter. I think if you widen the definition of the technology sector, the fit that Micah was describing is awkward with respect to IT services may become a natural part of innovative technologies because governments are well capitalized. Things that would be benefit company experiments for small and medium businesses are cost of turning on the lights for a day around here. And more importantly, state government's not going anywhere. And so we can invest in things that have much longer
Yeah, it's interesting.
Might be able to. And so I would encourage the folks who are listening who want to find solutions for government to think about places where government actually enjoys a competitive advantage.
Right. Energy upgrades to buildings that pay off over 30 years don't make sense for a commercial real estate company, but make great sense for the state of Connecticut.
All this into the state.
There.
Right. And we can make those investments not only on behalf of the state, but on behalf of our constituents. Right. The governor wakes up every day and thinks we've got some of the highest housing costs and some of the highest electricity costs in America. What can we do to address those middle class cost crises, or to build the Second Avenue subway a little faster or for a little less money? And if there are innovative technologies that can help with those problems, we're here for them in a way that we might not be on replacing our COBOL mainframes with systems.
Right.
To the tech, more traditional tech folks that we've been talking about so far, just to quickly run through it. And, issue spot, right? Like, there's still local journalism in America. Much as we like to celebrate its downfall, you can read New York, Politico's New York playbook, or New Jersey playbook, or the Connecticut Mirror. It will give you a sense of what problems government is struggling to solve, and let you come at the door with solutions to them. We talked about this earlier, but data shams are a real problem for us, right? Sometimes that's a creature of state law, sometimes more often it's federal restrictions. And I've gotten a lot of companies that walk in the door and say, we've got a great idea, but it relies on your handing over information about all of the indicated ones. And we just can't do that. Sometimes we can't even share it with another, from the right hand of state government to the left. And so you need either sophisticated data privacy, you need a sophisticated data privacy to leverage that. And then my last piece would be, two. One is we talked about this, trying to provide certain unified customer experiences across state government. We're not great at it. We're trying to get better, but we want to provide people the Apple or the Google sort of suite experience with common branding, similar logon. And so being mindful, at least if you're coming in the door, customer-facing technology, of how you would fit into whatever small suite of programs we've already managed to implement. And finally, I would say, if people haven't yet read Jennifer Polka, Recoding America book, she talks in one of the chapters about the importance of insiders in state government for driving technological adoption. Right? Government is built to be steady and stay the course, and it's for good reasons, but it comes with costs. And you need to know who your customer is in state government and engage with them and find one really willing to sponsor you over the forces of the status. Well, and if you can't do that somewhat early in the process, I would cut bait and try another state or try another.
Dennis, Mike, anything you want to add on that? Advice to founders?
Yeah, I think, the sort of on a similar vein, like the importance of, sort of persistence, and for a vendor, their level of, I guess, like patience and tolerance for, a difficult terms and condition process. I think it's sort of being able to figure out that language. The state is working on programs, especially if, it's a, minority or veteran-owned business. How are we sort of making sure that, things are more accessible there? But I think being able to break through and that sort of level of persistence helps. And then, John and Mike have said similar things, but this idea about looking for products that are leading edge and not bleeding edge, the importance of being able to present yourself as reliable, sort of, no one ever got fired for buying IBM type of mindset, is certainly a helpful way to present yourself.
There's sort of a technical or tactical, just sort of complementary point, perhaps, to the first point that Johnny made, which is, I think if you can avoid situating your business such that selling is going to require you to go through a procurement process to be a state contractor, you are going to be in a lot better shape, right? All of our states have lots of mechanisms where things are happening, money is being spent. Sometimes it's going through localities. Sometimes it's a grant program that there will be a competitive process, but it is not the same kind of competitive process where, where it's the full state procurement process to become a contractor. That is just to the points that Johnny and Dennis have made, just is always going to be hard, particularly if you're not a super well-established incumbent player in your field.
One point you guys raised, I think, is really important and frustrates me in the market is, people constantly, oh, it's so hard to sell a government, so hard to sell a government. First of all, it's hard to sell, period. It's hard to sell anyone. And if Microsoft is trying to buy something, it takes them quite a while to do something company-wide also, or a big commercial real estate company or what have you. And so it's not just government. I mean, any big institution needs to be really careful in how it vets things, especially if they're going to roll out very broadly or they're going to touch kind of core assets or core systems. So it's not just a government problem. And Johnny, I love your point that there are actually ways in which government is an easier sell for certain kinds of products and classes of products with very long-term payoffs. And I think that's a great kind of piece of advice to carry out of this. Last question for you guys before I open up for Q&A. So if there are questions from the audience, you can please chat them using the Q&A function. So we've been talking mostly about kind of tech selling or, vendors selling into government. But on the flip side, and Johnny, you mentioned a little bit of this already, your governments are also really interested in seeing, technology founders locating in your states from the perspective of economic development, whether or not they're planning to sell into state government. And, in each case, your states are taking important steps to try to incentivize entrepreneurs to locate businesses, at home. So I'd love to maybe go around the horn and hear a little bit about the steps your states are taking to promote that kind of economic growth.
We have tried to move away from supporting individual companies and towards making bets on sectors or making bets on losers. And it really starts with making bets on the Connecticut economy, right? We've got relatively low marginal tax rates, to my friends on the phone, and we're nevertheless making substantial investments in workforce training in Connecticut, in infrastructure in Connecticut, from New Haven to New York City on express trains and then 6 minutes for working further. And we're trying to make our small cities places where it's attractive for companies to locate, where the workers locate. Connecticut was a suburban state for 25 years when the suburbs were not cool. My favorite quote on this comes from GE. They were on their way out of a suburban office park in Fairfield. Their CFO got a question, said, "So you're moving because of the high taxes, right?" I said, "No, we're moving to Boston. Boston is not a low tax environment." The issue was in Fairfield, I couldn't walk out of my office and get a sandwich. Whereas in Boston, I can walk out of my office and get any kind of food I want and talk to 3 different entrepreneurs. And so we're trying to make Connecticut small cities more attractive. In terms of sector, tech-specific work, one is we're putting the right people in place. We have a new commissioner of economic development here in Connecticut, O'Keefe. He was the founder and managing partner of ATAX Digital. He was a general partner at TCV before that. So he knows these companies that we're trying to get in here and what we in place, motivate them. And we're coming up with things like the Connecticut Innovation Sandbox that I mentioned for the design folks who are here. A little bit of a heads up or a step up.
Yeah, so I think Governor Murphy has always been focused on making New Jersey the best state to raise a family. I think a lot of that sort of builds off, New Jersey's current strengths, the public school system, sort of progressive tax structure that allows for a lot of family-related investments, our location and sort of the infrastructure that we have that builds on that. We have not had a lot of major tech programs. I think similar to Connecticut, we inherited an economic development authority that really sort of just existed as a loan structure, and then sort of for various parts of the Christie administration, a tax credit distribution machine. We have been focused on being much more strategic there. And I think, similar to other Northeastern states, we tried to remake New Jersey into a leader for the film industry where film was invented. We've been focusing on offshore wind despite some hiccups there. I think being, all in on clean energy generally, and also sort of taking advantage of the adult use cannabis industry. We've been looking at, a few different ways to get New Jersey up and running. We've also been very focused on the tech side of things. So, I think sort of looking at other states that have had sort of venture capital related funds and projects, we started the Innovation Evergreen Fund here to, again, I think as we figure out ways to bring people to New Jersey, what are we doing to sort of make that tech community more appealing? So I think really focusing on building up the sort of venture percentage in New Jersey has been critical for us. And at the same time, it's sort of how do you mix that with making neighborhoods, mass transit, the sort of community side of life thing is more appealing.
Yep, thank you. So I'll just I think look, a lot of all three of our states I think are exploring in a lot of similar ways. I'll highlight two areas where I think New York has made really unusual, and I am optimistic that they will be very successful sectoral bets. One is on semiconductors, with the recruitment of Micron to build what will be the largest semiconductor fabrication facility in U.S. history in central New York. And, that is obviously in and of itself, it's sort of a big, significant economic development project. But what I think is really unusual and potentially game-changing about it for the state and for a lot of innovators and companies is I think it is going to create a whole ecosystem that does not presently exist in New York around both talent and supply chain that will be necessary and that will be an outgrowth of that project. And it's also going to just completely reinvigorate significant geographic swaths of the state. And so, and there's a fairly long runway until that is going to come into fruition. So I can't, and state government, I think, is really beginning the process of thinking about how do we invest in that ecosystem and make it much bigger than just this massive project by a single company. And so I think that there will be a lot of opportunities there for folks who start thinking about that question themselves. The other one is the bet that Governor Hochul just announced on AI. And here I think is something that is really unusual. The state has provided effectively 2-to-1 matching funds for an investment in using kind of combined purchasing power to access computing power that would otherwise be unavailable to nonprofit and public institutions through what we're calling the Empire AI Consortium. So we've taken a bunch of the nation's great academic research institutions, which happen to be located in New York. They've brought resources to the table. The state has brought resources to the table. Those resources are going to be combined to buy a slew of the necessary computing power to run large language models and do AI research that really is largely unavailable to academic institutions. And I think that one of the hopes of that will be the creation of a whole ecosystem of private, nonprofit, public sector partnerships, new companies, new ideas, new innovations that come out of it. And I think that if you're an innovator in the AI space, that there will be enormous opportunities to kind of bring those resources to bear to help catalyze your innovation in the state of New York.
Awesome. We have a couple questions from the audience. Let's see if we can get through a few of those before we run out of time. So first, from Connell McGill, the CEO of Enertiv, if a technology company has worked successfully with a particular city or state and sort of has gone through the formal procurement process and been awarded a contract, does that in any way lower the barrier for them to get a contract in another state? Or is it really like maybe a nice validation, but you're going to have to go through the full process all over again?
So state to state, I'm not aware of any advantage that accrues to you for being on a state contract or somewhere else other than these processes. Well, each busy in their own way show broad similarities, and if you navigate the next within Connecticut, however, if you're a state contractor, most of our municipalities can access the state. So rather than going through the process, approval and waiving or Stanford or concerned, if you're interested in serving statewide enterprises, come to us first, and then everyone else can.
So if you win at the state level, and I think this is true in other states, it's easier to get at the local level. And I know in California, if you win even a big city, it's actually easier for smaller towns to award you sole source. But across states, you're not going to get any benefit.
Not to my knowledge.
It's a bit of a sales pitch. We're doing it in New Jersey, maybe, helps you win, but it's not going to automate. bigger question from Thomas Smythe, who's another entrepreneur, about procurement reform. From his perspective, one of the challenges, for example, in delivering government benefit programs is that there are often a few relatively narrow set of service providers who've been approved to do it. And so there's kind of not that much competition. It's a bit of an oligopoly. And then if you actually just made it easier to contract with state government, that would create more entrants to the market and therefore maybe improve the overall, outcome and quality of services. In any of your states, have you guys thought about procurement reform? Do you think the system needs reforming, or is it the way it is for good reasons?
I'll take a swing at that. Look, I think in answering your very last question, Nate, to some extent, sure, it is the way it is for good reason. There's a ton of money sloshing around, and you don't want it to be able to be handed out willy-nilly. I think the reality is anybody who works in the executive branch of government and takes that work seriously and is held accountable for what government delivers, I think would wish for sensible procurement reform. Unfortunately, the political incentives, I think, are simply not there. That is the constituency for procurement. That is the constituency for procurement reform, executive branch government staff, and elected leaders. And, all the political incentives for the legislature, they want oversight, they want accountability, totally reasonable objectives for the legislature. And if things are going slowly, they can blame the executive. And so too, if you're in a watchdog spot, if you're a state treasurer or a state controller. So again, I had said earlier I'd be a pessimist, and I think here I would be a pessimist, which is I think that there is very little appetite for procurement reform, at least in New York. I don't know elsewhere.
I agree with Micah's analysis. I think there are small things we can do around the edges and sort of paperwork reduction. We had a law passed the Connecticut General Assembly a number of years ago that requires anyone doing business with the state to certify that they're not also doing business with Iran, contrary to federal dictates. You used to have to sign a separate sheet of paper to that effect. We baked it in. That saves you 10 seconds in a sheet of paper. But in terms of actually making it more competitive, 20 years ago, a governor of Connecticut went to prison because of issues, and the hangover from that is going to last for longer than I and my boss would.
I find there's sorry, Dennis, did you want to jump in?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think everything that Johnny and Micah said was correct, but if you can tie it to some type of budget measure, I think especially as states are in tighter fiscal situations, that was one of the big things on how, some of our health benefits, pharmacy benefit managers were procured.
I think this is a good example, though, where, from the outside, it's easy to say, oh, the system's broken. But then you realize there are actually some structural reasons it is the way it is, and probably some good public policy reasons. You actually, the flip side of it being a slow process is there's way less corruption. And the more that you open it up and give discretion to individual people, the more you create opportunities for graft or what have you. And so, there are actually some historic and sort of institutional reasons that things can be a little bit slow and there's a lot of process involved, or legislative checks and balances or what have you. It's similar with civil service reform. People are like, oh, it's crazy, they have all these protections. It's like, well, it's actually not great if the sitting governor can fire 32,000 employees in Connecticut and hire all of his or her buddies, because that creates perverse incentives of its own. So again, there's sort of some good reasons in place for all this.
I would just say to that, lack of competition is itself an invitation, corruption at a different time.
That's true. Well, I look forward to you taking up procurement reform very soon. We are at time. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. Thank you guys so much for being part of this. Really, really helpful. I think really great lessons for entrepreneurs. And Micah, maybe we'll get a few recruits for state government in the years ahead. So thank you guys for your time and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.